The smell of lemon cleaner had become part of my identity, clinging to my clothes, my skin, even the strands of my hair. Some might have called it mundane, but I found something soothing in the routine. The Meridian Tower stood like a glass and steel monument to ambition, rising 47 stories above Harborview's bustling streets. Every night, after the tide of executives and assistants poured out, I stepped in with my crew, Maria, Pete, Delilah, to restore order to the chaos the day had left behind. Most people never saw us. That was the point. But I took pride in the way the chrome elevator panels shone when I finished with them. The way our floors smelled crisp and sterile. The quiet hum of the buffer against marble tile gave me a peace I rarely found anywhere else. I didn't need recognition. I didn't want applause. I just needed the work to be done right. My way. I was the head custodian of one of the tallest office buildings in the city, and I wore that title like armor. Not out of arrogance, but out of survival. You don't come from where I did, rise to lead a team in a corporate tower, without learning how to carry yourself. Without standing taller, even when no one notices. Especially when no one notices. When I clocked out, it was nearly midnight, the city softened by the fog that always rolled in from the harbor. My shift boots left faint imprints in the mist on the pavement as I walked toward the parking garage, the keys jingling in my hand. I drove a 10-year-old sedan that rattled if you took corners too fast, but it got me where I needed to go. Home. A small townhouse just outside the city, nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac shaded by sycamores. Julian usually stayed up for me. He'd be reading on the couch, something dense about global retail trends or quarterly margins. That night, the light was on, but he didn't look up when I walked in. "Hey," I said, setting my keys in the bowl by the door. "Long night?" He was sitting on the edge of the sofa, elbows on knees, staring at the floor like it had betrayed him. I took a step forward, my boots still on, unsure if I should break the silence. "Julian?" He finally looked up. His jaw tightened, then loosened again like he couldn't decide whether to speak or swallow whatever was clawing at his throat. "My sister's wedding is this weekend," he said slowly. "I know," I said. "Bianca's finally marrying that tech guy, right? Emmett Blake. CEO's son." "Right," I nodded, offering a smile. "You said it's going to be at the Grand Fairford?" "That place is." "Tessa," he interrupted, voice flat. "I don't want you to come." I stared at him, unsure I'd heard correctly. "What?" He rubbed the back of his neck. It's not the right crowd. It's a very specific scene. High profile. There's a certain image." I blinked. "Image?" "You wouldn't fit in," he said, avoiding my eyes. I couldn't speak. It wasn't shock exactly, it was something deeper. A crack forming beneath the surface, too quiet to be heard, but unmistakable all the same. "There's more," he added, barely above a whisper. "I told them you died." My heart stopped. "What?" He looked at me then. Guilt flashing across his face for just a second before he shoved it down. "Years ago. I told my family you died. In a car crash." I couldn't find the words. Couldn't even summon the tears. I just stared at him, mouth slightly open, like my body had separated from my brain. I was climbing the ladder. Everyone I was dealing with came from money, legacy, appearances. I panicked. Your job, your background, it didn't align. "So you erased me?" I said, voice hollow. He didn't answer. I nodded once. Just once. Then I turned and walked to the bedroom. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. There was no dramatic confrontation, no begging. Just the quiet ache of something fracturing so deeply it couldn't be named. I packed a small duffel. Just a few things. The essentials. I slipped off my wedding ring and left it on the kitchen counter. He didn't follow me. Didn't ask me to stay. When I closed the front door behind me, the silence was complete. Back in the car, I sat behind the wheel, staring at the dashboard like it held answers. My hands were steady. My breath even. But inside, something had shifted. Not rage. Not despair. Just the slow, dawning realization that the man I loved had chosen an illusion over me. Over us. The city shimmered in the rearview mirror as I drove away, the lights blurring behind a veil of fog and headlights. I didn't know where I was going, only that I was going forward. Alone, but not broken. Not yet. The morning after I left, I checked into a small roadside inn off Route 7. A faded sign with peeling paint welcomed me with half-lit letters. It wasn't much, just a twin bed, a humming mini fridge, and thin curtains that barely blocked the sun, but it was somewhere he didn't know. Somewhere I could breathe. I stared at the ceiling for hours that first night, trying to understand how a man could erase his wife from his life with such cold precision. I kept replaying the moment he said the words. I told them you died. Not in anger. Not in cruelty. Just in the calm detachment of someone who had convinced himself it was logical. I didn't call anyone. Didn't explain. What could I possibly say? How do you tell people you've been made a ghost in your own life? Days passed in a haze of numbness. I kept going to work because work made sense. My body knew what to do even if my heart was barely functioning. I showed up at Meridian Tower before the sun rose, led my team through 12-hour shifts, and left when the city began to blink awake. I cleaned offices and polished glass, all while pretending I wasn't unraveling. Then, on a rainy Thursday morning, I returned to the inn after a night shift and found a thick envelope waiting at the front desk. No signature. Just my name scribbled in the same handwriting I'd once memorized on birthday cards and grocery lists. Julian's handwriting. My heart thudded as I opened it. Inside, divorce papers and a single sticky note. It's better this way. Don't reach out. No apology. No explanation. Just that. I stood there for a full minute, holding the note between my fingers like it might self-destruct. My ears buzzed. My chest tightened. Then I turned, walked calmly back to my room, and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at the wall and let the quiet absorb the blow. That was the moment I knew. I had no husband. No marriage. No place in the story Julian was building for himself. He had taken the years we shared, the holidays, the morning coffee rituals, the laughter, and tossed them like trash. In his new world, I had never existed. He'd chosen status over love. Image over truth. And somewhere along the way, I had stopped being his partner and started being his liability. I folded the papers and placed them on the nightstand. My ring finger felt bare, but I didn't miss the ring. I missed the lie I used to believe, that we were in it together. That night at work, I didn't tell anyone. But I moved a little slower. My hands ached from gripping the mop handle too tightly. Maria asked if I was okay, and I gave her the kind of smile that didn't reach my eyes. Just tired, I said. That kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. She nodded. She understood more than she let on. When I was alone on the 37th floor, emptying the recycling bins in the executive wing, I stood by the window and looked out over the city. Lights flickered like stars scattered across glass and asphalt. Somewhere out there, Julian was likely sipping champagne with people who believed he was a grieving widower. Somewhere, he was charming board members and laughing at dinners while I existed in shadows. Scrubbing floors he would never walk on. Cleaning up the messes of people who didn't know my name. But the strange thing was, I wasn't ashamed. Not of who I was. Not of what I did. I was a woman who worked. Who earned every cent with her own hands. I was the one who patched Julian's blazers and memorized his presentation scripts when he needed a practice audience. I was the one who stood by him before the title, before the car, before the elite circle he now clung to like oxygen. And now I was the one standing alone, broken but not destroyed. There was dignity in what I did. I could still look myself in the mirror. Could he? I left work just before sunrise. The city was still asleep, its heartbeat low and soft. As I crossed the lobby, I paused and looked up at the names etched in gold on the wall of building tenants. My reflection stared back at me in the polished marble. I didn't see a failure. I didn't see a woman discarded. I saw someone still standing. Let them think I was dead. Let them mourn a version of me they never bothered to know. I was still here. Sweeping the halls of their glass towers. Quiet. Unseen. But alive. And I was just getting started. I was restocking the supply closet on the 32nd floor when I heard the elevator ding behind me. It was past 8 in the morning, later than usual for me, but I had covered an overnight shift after Delilah called in sick. I was bone-tired, my back a knot of tension, and the strap of my cleaning cart had rubbed my shoulder raw. I didn't expect anyone to be up there yet. Most of the offices on 32 belonged to consultants and real estate firms who rarely arrived before 9. I didn't turn right away. I just kept sorting the microfiber cloths by color, something mindless to keep my hands busy while my thoughts drifted. It wasn't until the voice came, low, kind, steady, that I turned. "Excuse me, are you in charge here?" The man standing in the hallway wasn't dressed like the usual corporate climbers. No tailored pinstripe suit or flashy watch. Just a simple button-down, sleeves rolled, gray hair slightly tousled like he hadn't looked in the mirror before leaving the house. There was something unassuming about him, which instantly put me on edge. People like him didn't usually speak to people like me unless they needed something fixed or picked up. "I oversee the custodial team," I said, straightening a little, gripping the edge of the supply shelf. He offered a small smile. "I'm Rowan Blake." I knew the name. Everyone in the building did. Blake Holdings owned Meridian Tower. His name was on half the directories we cleaned. He wasn't just another suit, he was the man behind the curtain. The one with the power to make or break careers in a single email. My heart thudded once, hard. "Mr. Blake," I said, nodding in respect. "Can I help you with something?" He glanced past me at the open supply closet, at the perfectly aligned bottles and neatly coiled cords. "Actually, I was looking for someone, but I saw you working in." I just wanted to say something. I waited, not sure where this was going. "My mother was a custodian," he said, hands in his pockets. "Work nights in a bank building in Pittsburgh. Raised 3 of us on her own. Never took a sick day." I blinked, caught off guard. That's rare. People usually don't share things like that. He shrugged, his smile growing a little. "I've learned that titles mean less than character. And from what I hear, you've got a hell of a lot of that. Your name came up in a recent staff review." I froze. "It did?" He nodded. "A few tenants mentioned how clean and well-kept their floors are. Said there's this woman with dark hair who moves like she owns the place." I figured that had to be you. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, unsure what to say. Compliments weren't something I was used to receiving from people at that level, especially not from CEOs. "I just do the job right," I said softly. "That's all." Rowan tilted his head slightly, studying me with something I couldn't quite name. Curiosity? Respect? "Sometimes doing the job right is what holds the whole place together," he said. "People forget that. But I don't." He looked at his watch then, a subtle cue he had somewhere else to be, and offered his hand. I hesitated only a second before shaking it. His grip was firm, but not overbearing. "Keep doing what you're doing, Miss Quinn. The place wouldn't run without people like you." With that, he walked down the hall and disappeared into an office, leaving me standing there, hand still slightly outstretched, a strange knot forming in my throat. I hadn't realized how long it had been since someone looked at me without pity or pretense. Since someone saw me as more than a shadow passing through after hours. Back in the supply closet, I leaned against the shelf for a moment and let out a long breath. It was just a brief encounter, a passing moment, but something about it struck deeper than I expected. Maybe it was because he reminded me of the people I came from. People who worked with their hands. Who didn't need applause, just a roof over their heads and a job done well. Or maybe it was because he saw me. Not as a ghost. Not as someone to hide. But as someone worth noticing. When I returned to the janitor's office, Maria looked up from her checklist. "You okay? You're walking different." I smiled faintly. Just had a reminder. Of what? That being invisible isn't the same as being small. She nodded like she understood. And maybe she did. That night, as I rolled up the sleeves of my uniform and started wiping down the lobby's glass doors, I caught my reflection again. Same face, same tired eyes, but something behind them had shifted. Someone powerful had seen me. And for the first time in a long while, I saw myself too. It was a Thursday afternoon when the truth unraveled like a pulled thread from the hem of a uniform I no longer cared to mend. I'd been refilling the cart on the executive floor, replacing hand soap, stocking tissues, loading the cart with fresh sanitizing wipes. The silence was familiar, peaceful, but then I heard voices. Not the usual clipped tones of business calls or the rustle of papers. These were warm, relaxed, personal. The conference room door was slightly ajar. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but when I heard the name Bianca, my body went rigid. I recognized that name even now, Julian's sister, the one whose wedding I had been denied like an unworthy outsider. My hand froze on the sanitizer bottle, breath caught in my throat. I moved just a few steps closer, the wheels of the cart creaking softly beneath me. Inside, I saw Rowan Blake seated at the long table, his back to me, a half-empty coffee cup beside him. Across from him sat a tall, lean man with tousled hair and a confident ease about him, his son, Emmett, I assumed. I ducked back slightly, staying just out of view, my heart hammering in my ears. "Bianca's nervous," Emmett was saying with a slight laugh. "It's been a whirlwind. Planning a wedding in 6 months, it's a miracle it's all coming together." Rowan chuckled. "She's strong. It's a good match. Though I still can't wrap my head around the story her family told about Julian's first wife." "You remember?" "Yeah," Emmett said, his voice softer now. "A tragic car crash, wasn't it? Happened years ago. I think they said it was around 10 years back. Can't imagine how awful that must have been." Rowan's voice dropped. "It's strange though, Julian never talks about her. Not even in passing. That kind of loss, you'd think it'd leave more of a mark." Emmett gave a small shrug. "Maybe he's just private about it. Everyone grieves differently." They moved on quickly, switching topics, guest lists, vendors, speeches, but I didn't hear any of it. I couldn't. The blood had drained from my face, and my hands had gone clammy around the edges of the cart. 10 years. A decade. That's how long Julian had been spinning this story, weaving a lie so tightly into the fabric of his life that it had become indistinguishable from the truth. He hadn't just told them I was dead to protect a reputation. He had buried me, rewritten history to elevate himself. In his carefully curated world, I had never existed. Not even as a memory. Just a tragic footnote. I leaned back against the wall, my body heavy with the weight of realization. The insult wasn't just in the lie itself, it was in the casual way they spoke of it, the ease with which my supposed death had become part of their family lore. I was a ghost story. A convenient loss. Julian had stolen my life, my identity, and handed it to a room full of strangers wrapped in a tragic bow. And now he was about to be welcomed into a more powerful family, tied by marriage into the Blakes, with no trace of the woman who'd stood by him when he had nothing. I stood there for what felt like an hour, trying to swallow the rage building in my throat. Not the kind that erupted in fire, but the cold, calculated kind. The kind that made everything crystal clear. I'd been erased. Intentionally. Permanently. But I was still here. I returned to the janitorial office and sat for a long time without speaking. Maria looked over at me but said nothing. She knew by now when to give me space. I stared at the paperwork in front of me, cleaning logs, floor plans, chemical restock lists, but the lines blurred. None of it mattered. Not in that moment. That night, I walked the halls differently. My steps were heavier, my gaze sharper. I could feel the lie stretching across the walls of that building, embedded in the very marble I cleaned and the glass I polished. I had poured years into this place, into holding myself together when everything else crumbled. And the man I had once loved had swept it all into the gutter, chalking it up to a convenient tragedy so he could chase champagne and status. I reached the top floor just before midnight and stood before the massive windows overlooking the harbor. Below, Harborview shimmered in the dark, a city alive with motion and light. But I felt none of its beauty, only its coldness. He told them I died. Over and over, the words circled my mind, a slow, twisting knife in my chest. And they had believed him without question. Because it was easier to believe in a sanitized version of grief than to question a man who climbed social ladders with polished shoes and perfect timing. But I wasn't a story to be rewritten. And I wasn't going to stay quiet any longer. The morning of the wedding dawned gray and heavy, the kind of coastal fog that blanketed Harborview like a warning. I stood in the break room of Meridian Tower, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup, staring out the narrow window as the city blurred into the sky. It was supposed to be just another day, one shift closer to the weekend. I had every intention of ignoring the Mercer-Blake wedding altogether, burying myself in floor wax and scrub brushes until the storm of their celebration passed. But then my phone started buzzing. At first, I ignored it. I didn't recognize the number. Then another came through. And another. All different area codes, all numbers I didn't have saved. I silenced it, but the vibrations kept coming one after another, like the world had suddenly remembered I existed. Then a name lit up on the screen, Julian. I stared at it, frozen. I hadn't heard his voice since that night in our living room, when he told me I didn't fit the image he was curating. When he let me walk away like I was nothing. I almost let it ring out, almost dropped the phone back into my locker and walked away. But something, curiosity, spite, closure, pushed my thumb to answer. I didn't speak first. I let him do the talking. Tessa, he breathed, voice ragged. Thank God. I stayed silent. Please, he said quickly, I know you don't owe me anything, but I need to talk to you. No, I need you to come. To the Grand Fairford. Today. I finally spoke. Isn't it a bit late for a +1? He paused, then spoke fast, like everything was unraveling behind him. Rowan knows. Somehow, he found out. I think someone overheard something and said something to Bianca doesn't matter. What matters is, he knows you're alive. A long beat passed as that sank in. And everything is falling apart, he snapped. He's furious. Bianca's a wreck. Emmett won't answer her calls. It's a disaster. I tried to explain, I told them I was young, confused, scared, but it doesn't matter now. I leaned against the break room counter. You lied to everyone. For years. You buried me. I know, he said, voice cracking. I made a mistake. A terrible one. But this can't be how it ends. Please, just come. Help me explain. Just talk to them. You're the only one who can fix this. A laugh, sharp and bitter, escaped my throat before I could stop it. You want me to fix this? Tessa, he begged, they think I'm a monster. I'll lose everything. You don't have to defend me, just say you knew. That we drifted apart. That it wasn't like I made it sound. Please. Just come. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The man who once told me I didn't belong, who told his family I was dead because I didn't fit into his designer suit and cocktail party world, was now begging me to stand beside him like a shield. There was a knock at the break room door. Maria peeked in. Hey, we've got a leak on 24. I nodded, covering the phone. I'll be there in a sec. Julian's voice cracked through again. Please, Tessa. I know I don't deserve it, but just give me this. Help me make it right. I stood still for a long moment, staring at the floor, the tile I had mopped 100 times. Everything in my body screamed to hang up. But my heart, it was no longer raw. It was hardened now, sharp around the edges. I'll come, I said at last, voice flat. But not for you. He exhaled, relief flooding through the line. Thank you. Thank you. I ended the call before he could say anything else. The decision wasn't about helping him. It was about something far older, far deeper. This wasn't about Julian anymore. This was about the part of me he'd tried to erase, the part that had stayed silent long enough. I left the building early that afternoon, went back to the inn, and changed into the only dress I had that wasn't part of my uniform. Navy blue, simple, worn a few times for special events. I brushed my hair, tied it back, and looked at myself in the mirror. No pearls. No designer shoes. Just me, Tessa Quinn, custodian of Meridian Tower, ghost of the Mercer family, standing tall and visible. The Grand Fairford loomed like a palace when I arrived, swathed in white roses and velvet ropes. Photographers lingered outside, their cameras pointed at nothing in particular as guests filed in, laughing and sipping from crystal flutes. I walked past them all unnoticed. Invisible in plain sight. Just as I had been trained to be. But that was about to change. The hush that fell over the Grand Fairford lobby the moment I stepped inside was the kind of silence that didn't just fill a room, it stole the breath right out of it. People turned as if they'd felt a sudden drop in temperature, their conversations stuttering mid-sentence. Champagne flutes paused midair. Forks hovered just shy of mouths. A ripple of recognition, or perhaps confusion, moved through the space like a shiver. I stood at the entrance in my navy blue dress, modest, plain, decades behind the high fashion flitting through the room. No jewelry, no heels, just a steady stance and the kind of calm that's forged in the fire of humiliation and loss. I held my head high and let their stares wash over me like water over stone. Julian saw me first. He was near the stage, surrounded by members of both families. His jaw tightened the instant our eyes met. His expression was that of a man who'd hoped I wouldn't come and feared I might all at once. For a moment, he looked as though he'd come toward me. But something in my stillness must have warned him not to. I kept walking. My heels, cheap, reliable, clicked against the marble as I crossed the ballroom. Every step felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen from me, my dignity, my voice, my very existence. Bianca stood near the floral arch, her dress a waterfall of silk and pearls, her face flushed and tear-streaked. Emmett stood beside her, his posture stiff, eyes darting to Rowan, who looked like a man trying to hold back a tidal wave of disappointment. The room was dressed to perfection. White roses in tall glass vases, gold-rimmed place cards, strings of fairy lights cascading down like stars. But the energy was wrong. Something rotten sat beneath the beauty. I stopped in front of the crowd, in full view of everyone, and spoke clearly. No microphone. No stage. Just my voice, carrying through the tension like a razor. I'm not dead. A murmur swept through the room. I am Tessa Quinn, I continued. And I was Julian Mercer's wife for 8 years. Gasps, some audible, some sharp intakes of breath. Eyes widened. Chairs creaked as people leaned closer. I scrubbed floors while he climbed ladders. I packed his lunches while he rehearsed pitches. I believed in him when he had nothing but ambition and charm. And in return, he told you I was gone. Not gone as in we grew apart. Gone as in dead. Killed me off to make himself more palatable to people like you. I turned slightly, letting my gaze sweep across the room. I locked eyes with Bianca. Her face crumpled further, mascara streaking down her cheek. He erased me because I embarrassed him. Because I didn't wear designer labels or come for money. Because I was the custodian he married before he figured out who he really wanted to be. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The silence did all the amplifying for me. And you let him, I said. Maybe not intentionally. Maybe not knowingly. But you accepted the story. The tragic, convenient lie. Because it fit the narrative. Because it kept the image clean. Julian stepped forward, voice shaking. Tessa, please. No, I cut him off without turning. You had your chance to speak. For years, you held the mic. Now you listen. He froze, lips parted, as I finally looked at him. You could have told the truth and still moved on. We all have the right to outgrow people, Julian. But you didn't move on. You buried me alive. You let my absence make you look more powerful, more polished, more tragic. I shifted my attention to Rowan and Emmett. Rowan's expression had hardened, not with anger, but with profound disappointment. His eyes flicked to his son, who looked visibly stunned, hands clenched at his sides. I didn't come here to stop a wedding, I said, softer now. But I wasn't going to let this one happen based on a lie. And if you're smart, Emmett, you'll think long and hard about the family you're marrying into. Bianca let out a strangled sob, turning away, her shoulders shaking. I'm sorry, Emmett said, stepping forward. His voice was quiet, but clear. I didn't know. I believe you, I said. But now you do. He looked at Bianca, then at Rowan, and then slowly removed the ring from his finger. I can't do this. Bianca gasped, her legs giving way beneath her. Someone caught her as she collapsed into a chair, the image of perfection crumbling like dust. Julian stared at me, stunned, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came. I turned and walked back down the aisle, not the bridal kind, but the one lined with stunned faces and shattered illusions. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just walked, calm and steady, through the ruins of a fantasy they'd all built on top of my grave. And for the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt real. Outside the Grand Fairford, the sharp spring wind caught the hem of my dress as I stepped into the sunlight, but I didn't feel the chill. Not after that. Not after walking into a ballroom full of strangers and ghosts and telling the truth out loud for the first time in years. I stood beneath the arched entrance, my breath finally returning to a rhythm I hadn't felt since before Julian told me I was better off dead in his world. The marble steps beneath my feet felt solid. So did I. Behind me, the wedding unraveled. I could hear the distant clatter of hurried footsteps, muffled voices rising in a panic, but none of it reached me. I was done with that chaos. I had carried their silence long enough. I had borne the weight of their shame like it was mine. But not anymore. I hadn't even made it to the curb before Julian came rushing after me, his tie askew, hair wild, looking every bit the man whose carefully constructed kingdom had just collapsed. Tessa, wait. I stopped because I wanted to. Not for him. He came to a halt beside me, chest heaving. I didn't know you'd actually come, he said, breathless. But thank you. For what you did. For being graceful. That couldn't have been easy. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw not the man I once loved, but the man he had become. Still handsome, still sharp in that magazine cover kind of way. But hollow. Fragile in a way he didn't know how to hide. I didn't do it for you, I said simply. I did it for me. I know, he nodded quickly. I know. But listen, things got out of control. I never meant for it to go this far. I was under pressure and… No, I said, cutting him off like I had in that ballroom. You don't get to do that. You don't get to explain away the years you spent pretending I didn't exist. That wasn't pressure. That was choice. He flinched like I'd struck him. I loved you, I continued, my voice low but unwavering. I believed in you. But when it was time for you to decide whether I was someone worth standing beside in the light, you chose to leave me in the dark. You chose to pretend I died. He didn't argue. He couldn't. I know I messed up, he said. But maybe we could talk. Figure things out. Start over. I almost laughed at the audacity. Start over? Julian, you buried me. You mourned me to people who toasted your future while I was scrubbing floors. You told an entire lie about my death, and now you want to resurrect me because your perfect image cracked. I'm sorry, he whispered, looking small. I nodded once. So am I. And I meant it. Not with bitterness, but with the quiet kind of sorrow that comes when you finally release someone you once held too tightly. I turned without another word and walked away, not looking back, not even when he called my name one last time. I was already halfway down the street when I heard footsteps behind me, measured, confident, different. I turned to see Rowan Blake, still in his dark tailored suit, moving with the kind of ease that didn't ask for attention, but naturally earned it. I was hoping I'd catch you, he said, stopping beside me. His expression was unreadable, but not unkind. I think the entire ballroom is still trying to process what just happened. I didn't plan to ruin a wedding, I said. No, he replied. You didn't ruin it. You revealed it. I studied his face, waiting for judgment, but none came. I've seen a lot of people in my life claw their way to the top, Rowan continued. Most of them forget who helped them get there. But I've never seen anyone have the guts to speak like you just did. Not with that kind of clarity. That kind of dignity. I didn't do it for applause. I know, he said. That's why it mattered. We stood there a moment longer as the wind picked up, ruffling the lapel of his jacket. I'd like to offer you something, he said finally. Something that matches the strength I saw in you today, and the work I've quietly seen from you over the past year. I've been paying attention longer than you think. I raised an eyebrow. What kind of offer? I want you to come work for me directly. Director of Building Operations for Blake Holdings. You'd oversee maintenance and custodial teams across all our properties, Meridian Tower included. My breath caught. That's a big role. You're already doing the job in spirit, he said. You have leadership, precision, and the kind of integrity that can't be taught. You belong in that seat. I blinked, processing it. For years, I'd existed in the background. Julian had wanted me small, silent. But here was a man offering me a place at the table because of the very things my husband once found inconvenient. "I'll need to think about it," I said carefully. He nodded. "Of course. Just know the door's open." He handed me a card, then tipped his head in farewell and walked back toward the hotel. I stood there for a long moment, watching the city pass by, honking cars, flashing lights, life moving forward. I looked down at the card in my hand, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like something was opening instead of closing. The new apartment overlooked the harbor, quiet, sunlit, and nothing like the place I used to share with Julian. The windows opened wide to let the salty breeze in, and at night, the city lights shimmered across the water like a reminder that everything kept moving, no matter who tried to bury you. It was small by most standards, but to me, it felt enormous. It was mine. Every corner of it bore my choices, not someone else's expectations. 3 weeks had passed since the day I walked into the Grand Fairford and tore the curtain off the Mercer fantasy. In that time, I'd accepted Rowan Blake's offer. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. I spent a week turning it over in my head, wondering if I was ready to step into a title that carried weight, responsibility, and visibility. I thought about how I'd spent years being invisible on purpose, keeping my head down, doing good work without ever needing the spotlight. But then I realized something. I wasn't afraid of being seen. I was afraid of being seen and dismissed again. This was different. This wasn't a man asking me to be less so he could be more. This was an opportunity offered because of who I already was. I didn't need to pretend. I just needed to lead. The first day I walked back into Meridian Tower as Director of Building Operations, the security guard at the front desk did a double take. "Miss Quinn?" I smiled. "Still me, Marcus. Just a different badge." He grinned and waved me through with a little salute. Upstairs, the crew was already on site, Maria, Pete, and Delilah in their navy polos, organizing equipment just like they had every morning for years. When they saw me walk in wearing a tailored black blazer and slacks instead of my usual uniform, Maria dropped her clipboard. "No way," she said, eyes wide. "You serious right now?" "Promotion came through," I said casually, but I couldn't hide the grin that pulled at my mouth. Delilah gave a whoop and hugged me tight, and Pete just nodded with quiet pride. "About time someone saw it," he said. It felt surreal at first, sitting at a desk instead of pushing a cart, holding meetings instead of taking orders, signing vendor contracts instead of mopping up their spills. But in every meeting, every walkthrough, every phone call, I held onto the same values I always had: respect for the work and respect for the people doing it. I made sure my crew had what they needed, that their voices were heard. I advocated for better equipment, higher safety standards, more training. And when someone tried to cut corners to save a few bucks, I didn't blink when I said no. People started calling me boss, but it didn't feel like ego. It felt like acknowledgement. I never asked for power. I just asked for fairness. And now I had the chance to build that for others. One afternoon, I caught Rowan passing through the building. He paused when he saw me in the lobby, clipboard in hand, mid-conversation with a contractor about HVAC repairs. He waited until I finished speaking, then stepped over with a smile. "You look like you've always belonged here," he said. I shrugged. Maybe I did. Just took the long way around. He laughed softly. "I hope you're settling into the role." "I am," I said. "There's a lot to clean up, some of it literal, some of it not. But I like that part." He nodded. "Keep going. The building's already better for having you in charge." That night, I stayed late, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I walked the halls alone, not as the custodian who cleaned up after the day, but as the woman responsible for the building itself. I paused on the 32nd floor, where I had first spoken to Rowan. I remembered how I used to wipe down that hallway in silence, how I never imagined anyone powerful would stop and ask me my name. And now, I was the one making decisions. I was the one people came to for answers. I had stepped out of the shadows, not by force, but by choice. I went up to the rooftop before heading home. From there, harbor view sprawled out below me, a patchwork of buildings and possibility. My phone buzzed, Maria sending a photo of the crew holding a surprise "Congratulations" banner. I smiled, my heart full in a way I hadn't thought possible again. The woman Julian tried to erase had not only survived, she had risen. And this time, there was no going back. The knock came just after 7 in the evening, soft but unmistakable. I was on the balcony, sipping tea and watching the harbor settle into dusk. The sky was painted in shades of apricot and steel, that golden hour light washing over the water like something out of a dream. I didn't move at first. I just stared out, letting the cool breeze graze my skin, knowing, somehow, who was standing on the other side of that door. When I finally opened it, Julian was there. He looked different. Smaller. Not physically, he was still tall, dressed in one of those tailored coats he used to love, but the energy around him had changed. He didn't wear confidence like a second skin anymore. He wore something closer to weariness, maybe regret. Or maybe just the realization that not everything could be bought or spun. "Tessa," he said, almost reverently, like saying my name might unlock something between us. I waited. I didn't invite him in. He glanced past me, taking in the apartment. "This is nice," he said, a weak attempt at normalcy. "Peaceful." "It is." I wasn't sure if you'd even answer. Neither was I. We stood in silence for a moment. I didn't offer a seat. I didn't need to make this comfortable. Not for him. "I came to say I'm sorry," he said, finally. "Not just for what I did at the wedding, or the way I handled it when Rowan found out. I mean, for all of it." I folded my arms, leaning against the door frame. "You'll have to be more specific." He winced. "For lying to my family. For pretending you were gone. For choosing my career, my image, over you. I've replayed it so many times, and I still don't know what made me do it. I think I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That I'd embarrass you by being who I am? That people would see your wife cleans buildings and decide you weren't good enough." "Yes," he said, not even trying to hide it. "That's exactly it. I didn't want them to look down on me. I spent so long trying to climb out of the life I was born into, I thought if I kept one piece of it, it would drag me back down." I let that sink in. The way he said one piece of it as if I were part of the burden. As if my existence was something shameful. I used to make excuses for him. He didn't grow up with love. He didn't know how to receive it. But now, hearing the words plain as day, I felt nothing but clarity. "You didn't just leave me, Julian," I said. "You erased me. You didn't want to face the discomfort of being married to someone like me, so you killed me off in your world and kept climbing. That's not fear. That's cowardice." He looked down, throat tightening. "I know. I live with it every day. I didn't offer comfort." He'd built this weight himself. "I saw your speech," he said quietly. "Well, I didn't need to. I heard about it from every person who was there. They said you stood in front of everyone and told the truth with more grace than I ever deserved. You destroyed every lie I'd ever told without raising your voice." "Truth doesn't need volume," I said. "Just conviction." He nodded. "You deserved so much more from me." I tilted my head slightly. "I did. And now I have it. Without you." He hesitated. "I was wondering if there's any part of you that would consider talking again. Just to talk." "I don't expect anything, I know what you want, Julian," I said gently. "You want a version of closure that eases your guilt. You want me to forgive you so you can move on without the weight. But forgiveness isn't something I owe you. Not now. Not ever." His eyes filled, but he didn't cry. "I never meant to hurt you like that." "But you did," I said. "And that's the part you have to carry, not me." He nodded slowly, taking a step back. "Okay," he said softly. "I understand." I opened the door wider, just enough to let my words follow him out. "I don't hate you, Julian. But I don't love you either. Not anymore. I grieved that love already. And in a strange way, I'm grateful. You let me go. And in that space, I found myself." He swallowed hard, nodded once more, and then turned, walking down the hallway, his footsteps softer than I remembered. I didn't watch him reach the elevator. I just stepped back inside and closed the door behind me. The harbor was glowing now, the sun kissing the edge of the horizon. I stepped back onto the balcony, tea still warm in my hands. I breathed deeply. Not just air, but peace. Freedom. I hadn't just survived what Julian did to me. I had risen from it. And now, at last, I was free.